So I will start with an ethnographic introduction. One mid-May morning, as the hillside smoldered, a jeep thundered into Cacheparo. The fires had been alight since earlier that afternoon, but they were hardly inconspicuous. Out of the jeep jumped a green-clad forest officer, accompanied by 5 young Pano men. Who lit these fires? The officer asked a group of women sitting nearby. They simply ignored him. Quite quickly, a group of conned men gathered around. Who is responsible? You know we can take you to court, they asked. A few nodded their heads and offered some deference as the officer addressed them, but nobody replied. Nobody betrayed the culprits. In fact, few people actually knew who was responsible for the fire lighting. Instead, they lay the blame with the villagers over the hill. Why don't you ask them in deer color, they said. When the forest officers went there, they would similarly lay the blame elsewhere. Anonymity was on their side. So these highlands remain under extensive swidden cultivation, which is a method of discontinuous cropping coupled with longer periods of fallowing. At certain times of the year, before the monsoon rains when the swiddens are burnt, the whole terrain takes an otherworldly feel. Embers traverse the underwood and smoke plumes create a lingering purple haze. So there's considerable enmity between the Kuchekond and the forest department over the burning and the cutting of the hillsides. Poruchasa, as the Odisha government refers to it, is officially prohibited. Utilitarian narratives of waste and productivity persist in post-colonial development agendas. While we can speak of intimate antagonisms and a degree of toleration, some official titles for lowland non-swidden plots, and some use rights under the 2006 Forest Rights Act, the vast majority of land is cultivated de jure illegally. So given the restrictions and the considerable outside pressures, I found it remarkable that for the majority of Kuchekond families, swiddening persists as the most important livelihood activity. In the 2 villages that were the focus of my research, which I call by the pseudonyms Cacheparo and Kamuri, swidden cultivation was the primary livelihood for all but 4 of over 60 households. In contrast, of only 3 Pano households in nearby Jalipadari, only 3 of those households were engaged in swidden agriculture, and only those through the role of a barika, a kind of ritual messenger, in nearby Kutia villages. So in this talk, I focus on swidden agriculture and what it means for the Kuchekond and the Pano, considering their intertwined but their differently experienced realities of land, labor, and life. I ask why it is, despite illegality, outside pressures, and rapid social changes, that swiddening persists for the Kuchekond. And I argue that it's not just an economic means of making a living, but a means of making life. So this is not just production or even necessarily social reproduction. It's the rhythmic and attentive engagements, the temporal cycles of effort and intensity, the spaces of autonomy that continue to draw people to the swidden hillsides. So this talk will proceed through 3 broad sections. The first considers the place of swiddening in a changing agrarian economy of the Odisha highlands. In the second, I provide a detailed ethnographic account of the ritual of Nela Opondi, the taking of the swiddens, one of many agrarian rituals which tell us about the social importance of the swiddens. Thirdly, I consider the rhythms of swidden work in contrast to those of wage labor and the different meanings of land, labor, and life for the Kuchekond and the Pano. But I begin with a little bit of context. So Kandhamal is a district in the central southern highlands of the East Indian state of Odisha. Here, the undulating triangular hills are a far cry from the congested coastal cities. Over 65% of the land area here is forested, and the majority of the population are rural. In official statistics, Kandhamal, like much of southern Odisha, is one of the poorest places in eastern India. Of the population of Kandhamal, more than half, about 53%, are scheduled tribe, and roughly 15% are scheduled caste. So these administrative classifications correspond with the more general terms Adivasi and Dalit, encompassing groups at the lowest rungs of India's social and economic hierarchies. Of the former, the scheduled tribes, the majority here are the Kond. There are various Kond subgroups, so those in the plains appear much like their Hindu caste neighbors, while those in the highland regions continue to practice swidden cultivation and forms of animistic religion. Of the scheduled castes, the majority here are the Pano. So while the Pano have their own villages, you often find a number of Pano households within or adjoining Khond villages. Historically, the Pano had close relations with the Khond, performing herding duties, weaving cloth, sourcing sacrificial animals, selling liquor, as well as holding ritual and mediatory roles in Khond villages. For the Khond, the Pano were quasi-brokers to the outside world, while the Khond themselves held the abundance of the hills. So the Khond-Pano relation has been central to the history of Kandahar. During the period of British colonialism, some Pano consolidated areas of land through debt traps and came to dominate local business. Today, the dynamics have been reversed somewhat, with affirmative action policies and electoral politics weighted more in favor of the Khond numerical majority. So the Khond-Pano relation has been a major fault line as well for communal tensions, which have erupted sporadically, and most notably in 2008. So that was just the general context of the district of Kandahar, where I did my research. And my research was located specifically in the southwesterly highlands. And here the hillsides rise up to about 2,500 feet and are patchworks of forest, swidden gardens, and fallows. Following the winding road from the plains, you reach a small weekly market village with a variety of state and non-state institutions. The forest department, a resident platoon of Maoist hunting army troops, the administrative panchayat office, as well as many small roadside shops run mainly by Oriya castes. On the outskirts of the market, you find villages of the Pano and Hinduized Gond Adivasi. So the Gond and the Khond are different groups, and the Gond are kind of a minority here, and they're mainly elites. On the outskirts of the market, you find, in the surrounding hills, meanwhile, a home to the Kutia Khond. So I resided in 2 Kutia Khond villages for 22 months. One village I call Kachaparu was situated just a few kilometers from this weekly market. Near Kachaparu was the Pano village of Jalipadari, with which those in Kachaparu had many connections. After a year in Kachaparu, I shifted to Kumudi, and this is Kumudi here in the picture, around 10 kilometers distant and accessible only by a strenuous hillside climb. While also having strong connections to the Pano in Jalipadari, Kumudi stood in contrast to Kachaparu. There were no individuals with any employment or any education, and many could not speak the state language Oriya. The contrast between these 2 villages, as well as their shared connections to the Pano and Jalipadari, allowed me to grasp some of the transformations, both within and between Khond-Pano groups. So briefly, I want to mention here that this area has seen some important anthropological work. So Verrier Elwin in the 1940s, Hermann Niggemeier in the 1950s, a couple of decades later, Gerd Pfeffer and one of his students, Albert Gertzelmann, and in the 1990s, a team led by Mahir Januar. In recent years, however, the communal unrest and the Maoist insurgency have meant that research has been limited. Writing about the Saura, another Adivasi group roughly 100 kilometers to the south, Piers Vitebsky wrote in 2017 of how a whole generation of people were losing their way of living. The story he tells is one of new ways of being, related largely to Christian conversion, but also forms of reformist Hinduism. In the Kutia Khond area, however, while a minority of Pano are Christian, there has been a marked and at times violent resistance to the missionary activities. The region has also, until quite recently, retained a degree of isolation. It was only in 2016 that a year-round tarmac road was constructed, and it's only within a generation that young people have received any substantial education. But this does not mean things are unchanged. So in the 1950s, Hermann Niggemeier described the land as fertile with ample space. But still in his account, we can perceive the seeds of change. In 1955, he writes, the forest department attempted to shift 4 villages to a new common area, away from swiddening to rice cultivation. Although, as he writes, the villagers resisted the attempts. Today, the main issues here are government road building projects, residential schooling, and the growing influence of Hindutva-inspired reformist Hinduism, amongst predominantly the educated and socially mobile Khond. Nonetheless, swidden cultivation, as well as buffalo sacrifices and various animistic rituals, remain commonplace. So this is not a simple story of a vanishing world, nor is it one solely of peasant resistance or homegrown indigenous capitalism. The Kutia Khond engage with Indian modernity, shifting between compliance, opportunism, speculation, and resistance, combining market exchange with non-market forms of solidarity. Their situation is in many respects better than their counterparts in the plains. Even as many things are changing, swidden agriculture, as well as sacrifice, continue to contribute to the reproduction of what people understand and want life to be. So Oria historian Biswa Moipati suggested swidden cultivation was adopted as groups were pushed from the plains into the forested hills, or in James Scott's terms, a kind of footloose escape agriculture. While it's difficult to determine the exact time frame, swidden agriculture is certainly not a primitive relic, and the huge variety of swidden systems found worldwide, all oriented around the practice of fallowing, is testament to human creativity. Not backward and unproductive, swidden systems involve meticulous attention, labor that is agentive and skilled. Swidden hills may be unruly landscapes and difficult to govern, but this does not mean that all those who live within them are entirely resistant to modernity. So in the Kutiakond highlands, we find various systems of composite swiddening. So while the hillsides are where much of the food is grown, many kinds of pulses, millets, tubers, and maize. In fact, in this picture here, all of these grains and pulses, apart from the rice at the bottom there, were all grown by one family in 1 year on one hillside. They are combined with cash crops of sesame and mustard on the flat field land, small areas of river-fed or rain-fed paddy, home garden horticulture, and the sale of the small areas of agroforestry, as well as foraging, animal husbandry, the sale of forest produce, and wage work. What are commonly separated as modes of subsistence, foraging, agriculture, horticulture, and even pastoralism, are all to some degree present. Narratives of agrarian transformation often eschew marginal cultivators as existing under subordination under the broader logics of neoliberal capital. The Kutiakond have adopted cash cropping, daily wage labor, and taken on broader livelihood strategies through education and migratory work. But still, these Swiddens were the attentive focus. Families would intensify and disintensify their work, Swidden work, take up other activities in the fallow months of Swidden effort, take advantage of state schemes, only to return to the Swiddens when the incentives had dried up. In the cultivation seasons, the Swiddens were bountiful, while the fields behind the homes, for which there were sometimes individual land titles and where cash crops were grown, they usually stood empty. Marginal cultivators are not economically illiterate, but skillful in managing opportunities. In some sense, Swiddening resists that irreversible evolution assumed by theorists to be universal, from foraging to domesticated life. So Swiddening has never been static. It transformed with the iron trade and with the introduction of foreign crops such as maize. At the top there is maize. And I was told of the past varieties of pulses and grains no longer cultivated, but I still documented more than 15 varieties, grains and pulses grown across the Swiddens, as well as a huge variety of tubers and foraged foods. So the situation here is different to the case presented, for example, by Tanya Lee, where Indonesian highlanders willfully adopted capitalist relations. Swiddening almost represents a creative response to material circumstances, malleable and encompassing much more than just production. Nonetheless, before turning to the realities of Swiddening, I wish to draw attention to one transformation that stems from the very protective measures intended to support forest-dwelling groups. So briefly, the Forest Rights Act, this is a piece of legislation that gives either families or groups some use rights to the forest. While certainly an important piece of legislation, it has subtle, perhaps unintended consequences. Firstly, it has increased permanence and land use pressure by neglecting the longer cycles of fallowing. Secondly, a major activity feeding into the Forest Rights Act is the establishment of monocultural teak plantations, bolstered by the 2016 Compensatory Fund Act, which is it's an act that means that any forest land taken from development projects elsewhere has to be compensated with equal amounts of forested land. The problem is, it's on the customary lands of Adivasi forest dwellers, which is where much of this afforestation is taking place. So in many Kutiakond villages, you find teak plantations. Taking up to 20 years to reach maturity, teak is of little use to local people, and the roots grow horizontally, stifling other growth. The fixing of plots under the Forest Rights Act and the implementation of plantations on customary Swidden land is reducing land availability and leading to a greater permanence in land holdings. Even though Adivasi land is in principle inalienable, it cannot be sold to non-tribals. This does not prohibit state capture and the shifting of land tenure from within. Much of the land within village boundaries is today classified as state-owned, reserved, protected, or demarcated forest. As such, swiddening persists by and large de jure illegally. So state processes of reterritorialization are imposing new forms of legibility, and the landscape appears almost as a palimpsest, a manuscript of overlying layers. But as Alfred Gell noted for the Muriagond, government controls on forest land may have removed the easy come and go attitude to land, but people were still able to combine agricultural work with new state opportunities. This seems to be the case too for the Kutiakond. The swidden economy contributes to the mutual enhancement of resource use, enabling people to participate in the market economy, in many instances on their own terms, even if there are some shifts now happening within. So the Swiddens still hold value. Indeed, in some locations, villagers have taken to cutting down semi-mature government teak plantations, planted on their customary lands, to reinstate the hillside Swiddens. For the Kutiakond, the Swiddens is not only a space of material production, it's a space of ritual potency, of kin solidarity, a space of relief and escape from state officials or troublesome villagers. It's a space with its own rhythms, its own cycles of effort and fallow. It is not and has never been static, but an agroecological and cultural system of making life under transformation, containing within it what Tanya Lee called a will to improve, but also a will to self-determination. So as I will now seek to show, swiddening is more than just an economic activity, a coping strategy, or an escape strategy. I consider swiddening as a way of making life, an activity that brings together vital and social processes, rhythms and attentive foci. I turn now to a ritual that marks the beginning of the swidden cycle, which I describe with some ethnographic detail. Such agrarian rituals are inseparable from the sequences of economic activities. They mark moments of attentive attunement to and modulation of the rhythms of life. So one Sunday in February of 2019, I joined the opening of a new swidden field. The area known as Bakinella had been under 15-year fallow. Gumarenja explained, who was in the red there. Baki has not been cut for many years. We have left it so long that the tree creepers are big now. When it's like this, we must make sure we ask Baki Penu before we start any work. I know the Penu, I can call them. So the Penu are various potencies and forces that populate the landscape, and loosely we can refer to them as gods. So as the Kutaka, a kind of spirit medium, Gumarenja's presence was required to enter into the dialogue with the Penu, to request permission and to offer his own body for the Penu to speak through. First, there was the task of remembering where the stone Dani was. This is the collection of stones that marks the ritual altar at the center of each customary land division. Gokana and Subash were discussing the place where sacrificial offerings would be made. At the top, Jakai Tamu, we must place the blood of the Dani top. Baki Penu, the god of this land, will eat it from there. Gumarenja sat facing the Dani stone and held a winnowing fan filled with millet and rice grains. He started in a hushed voice, barely audible at first. He moved the winnowing fan up and down, circling the grains around inside. Suddenly, as his body began to shake and sweat started to drip from his forehead, his hushed tones burst into a great wail. This was the calling stage, calling the Penu to him. His body shook and his eyes were glazed. In one movement, Gumarenja raised himself and slammed the winnowing fan onto the Dani. Those around rushed to stretch out his bent limbs. Gumarenja's countenance changed. Continuing to rock back and forth, he spoke in normal tones. Who are you people? He first asked in Oriya. The reply from others came in Kui. Kond people, we don't understand Hindi. We don't understand Oriya. We don't understand Malayalam. We are Kutia people. Speak to us in the Kutia language. Gumarenja lapsed back into calling the Penu. Others shouted, speak, speak. We have leopards, bears, and snakes. The leopards are eating our goats. Gumarenja, speaking as a Penu, eventually asked, so what will you do? What will you give? All then replied, we will give grains for the Penu. So Gumarenja then continued to mix the grains in the winnowing fan and drew a pinch to place in the hands of those present. All looked intently at these grains to see how many and if any husks were broken. The divinatory dialogue had been successful. The following Sunday was the closing day of the Swidden opening festival. On this occasion, the whole village was in attendance. The culmination involved a public ritual of pig sacrifice, conducted not by the Kutaka, but by the Jani priests, a group of ritual specialists responsible for large sacrificial rituals and recitations. After the sacrifice, everybody stood around the large tree and exerted a shout. Then silence. They were listening for sounds of animals in the forest, sounds of monkeys, elephants, leopards, which if heard were a sign that the Penu was displeased. There was no sound, and they set about ritually cutting the first tree. So in the first volume of Coral Gardens and Their Magic, Malinowski long ago highlighted the conjoining of social, political, religious, and economic dimensions in the activity of food making. Since then, generations of anthropologists have sought to collapse the spheres of economy and ritual. Here, Nellarapondi, along with numerous other agricultural rituals, frame the whole productive process. The world of work and the world of ritual are directed towards the same ends. The distinction is in many respects untenable. There's not only an orientation to a future product, but also recognition of past obligations, as well as an attention to productive potencies, the penu, responsible for the fecundity of life. Indeed, the Swidden hillsides are the attentive foci. During Bia Katina, which is the Meria sacrifice, the largest event in Kuchekon ritual calendar, the final sacrificial act takes place on the Swidden hillsides. During Punikalo and Takalu, two harvest festivals, the new Swidden products are ritually eaten in a commensal relation with the panu. During most large rituals, millet grains are mixed with the blood of sacrificial animals in a winnowing fan, in ascetic parallel to the deep red millet beer ritually brewed for the same occasions. So in Kumudi, the communal ritual activities were central to everyday life. They were moments of attentive focus. Just as the rhythms of Swidden work cycled between intensity and repose, these rituals marked moments almost of rhythm finding. There was not an acting out necessarily of an ordered cosmic representation, but moments where a semblance of surety was created from uncertainty, an attempt to bend the agency of the world to the agency of the living. Attention may be directed to those that hold the fertility of life, or as Marshall Salins characteristically provoked, the spirits own the means of production. But expanding of the musical metaphor, these appeared more as moments of modulation, agentive attempts to bring the fecundity of life under the remit of communal needs. There is little distinction between the aims of ritual and the aims of work. In Kachaparu, the other village closer to the market and comparatively more developed, there was a difference. Nellarapondi and other rituals were not celebrated with the same communal verve, and many of the younger generation paid little heed. Still, even if the ritual foci had waned, there's a different story to tell here, related to the kinds and rhythms of work people chose to undertake. It's to this, in Kachaparu, I turn now. So just after sunrise, for many months of the year, Tikori, his wife Makuti, and his youngest daughter Sukanti would ascend to the Swidden hillsides in Kachaparu, carrying metal kettles of thick mandia porridge. On many occasions, I accompanied them, often working, but at times we would just sit in their small wooden hut, discussing village affairs or cooking a recent collection of tubers. Swidden work came in bouts of intense activity, coupled with long periods of repose, spent watching, waiting, and keeping away animals. This did not mean disengagement. A moment of inattention could, in the case of a sounder of hungry wild hog, ruin a significant proportion of a year's crop. Then again, being ready at the right moment could mean easy hunting. Swidden agriculture proceeds in accordance with an operational sequence, from the ritual opening to the cutting, planting, tending, weeding, harvesting. In principle, two sequences exist in parallel. As in the second year, hardier crops of millet are grown across the whole hillside, so you usually have two fields on the go at any one time, but not always. As Jane Geyer writes, certain tasks anchor possibilities and determine economic rhythms. Here, these are the tasks of swiddening. It's not my intention here to describe in detail this sequence of activities, but rather the temporal and spatial orientations that come together in the rhythms of swidden work. So at the smallest of scales, there are the somatic rhythms of working movements, the cutting of the forest, the threshing of grain, or even just the idle sitting and watching. So too, these everyday activities are mythologically important. Threshing, winnowing, and pounding are central tropes in Kutia cosmogonic myth. Perhaps in some sense, the time of work and the time of myth are one and the same. Then there are the temporal cycles of effort in terms of the different tasks undertaken. A day of cutting may be combined with foraging, with socializing, with hunting, with rice and cash crop cultivation. Labor action on the swiddens fluctuates between bursts of intense activity and much longer periods of rest and socialization. Labor input may be heavy in the initial stages, but then it declines in terms of effort. This is not an endless toil of manual labor, but self-controlled rhythms of exertion and rest. As Gregor Dobler writes, the steady rhythm of repetitive movement is punctuated by a freer movement of engagement and disengagement. By organizing attention and detention, both mutually facilitate each other. So then at a larger scale, there are the seasonal cycles of tasks, rituals, and events, the operational sequence. This involves some attuning to the external logics of seasonal temporality, but made fixed and made real through people's practical enactment of them. Certain families too may guide their own pattern of exertion towards heavy work one year to mean lesser work the next. In a sense, like even a kind of quasi-effort banking in relation to the opportunities and pressures of the wider economic system. Or in other words, modulation of the rhythms of ecological seasonality. In a longer cycle again, the settlement forms a nucleus around which in principle, movement takes place, situated in longer migrational histories and biographical stories of genealogical association. So people would often talk about past years, at least those at relatively recent memory, with regard to the swidden fields cultivated. Family and lineage histories were told as, to use Anna Singh's phrase, a swidden biography. The landscape is infused with narrative where micro-toponyms serve to mark past swiddens, event locations, abandoned villages and burial grounds. In this shifting, moving landscape of fallows, it is the stone danis that give some permanence. Extensive mythical and real historical movements across the landscape are recounted in most ritual recitations. So these concrete and experiential modalities of social time are central to the attentive orientation of swiddening. Rhythm is one of the primary factors that shape intentional action and restrictions placed upon it, emerging in the interplay of worker and task. As Dobler writes, work is Janus-faced, dictated by necessity, but also constituting meaningful worldly action. People always maintain an agentive ability to transform even the most arduous work through rhythm. But it's not just the rhythms of individual working movements. Sequential rhythms express broader forms of agency, those of the penu, which intermix with the resonances of the natural world and other social activities. In his classic account, Evans Pritchard discussed the relation of cattle pastoralism and seasonality to the newer segmentary social structure. While perceptive, this account tended to neglect the concrete lived spaces of activity, as well as producing an over-naturalism of nature. The rhythms of seasonality are just one that people choose to engage with. Natural and social rhythms intertwine, are modulated and shifted as people make their own lives. Life is not just a biological base and a social superstructure. But also, in a sense, rhythm is not just time. It's not just meter and measure and ordered sequence of movements, but it's also form, ephemeral shape, and improvisation. Indeed, this sort of understanding is present in the work of Henry Lefebvre, who suggests social life can best be understood through rhythmic processes, the alternating of intensity, the back and forth, the dialectics. In some sense, we could say that rhythm is not a frame for agency, but rhythm is agency. The rhythms and intensities that pulsate in particular sequences of activities gives form to the making of life itself. So in swiddening, we see the intertwined rhythms that emerge from situated actions and intensive engagements with the landscape. Not just environmental seasonality, but a chorus of polyrhythms that mix and modulate with those of wage labor, of trade, and of other activities. Of course, this does not mean to say that swidden work is easy. Much is dependent on the household labor and systems of mutual aid, as well as the health of a domestic community over time. But swiddening is not just monotonous agricultural toil. Crucially, today people are able to compare swidden life to other forms of life, and it's not inevitable that people choose to engage with it. To gain a greater sense of this, I will now contrast swidden work with wage work and situate this discussion more in terms of the Cond-Pano distinction. So in contrast to the Kutiakond, for the Pano, the Swiddens are by and large inaccessible. A few figures, mainly people known as barakas, receive Swidden land in exchange for the performance of ritual duties in Kond villages. But most Pano have employment as teachers, punchard workers, run small shops, or are businessmen involved in the sale of Kond produce, while many others are involved in liquor production and wage work. Poorer Pano families had a choice: cultivate close relations with the Kond, or be forced into situations of menial wage and migratory work. For many poorer Pano families, wage work was a livelihood necessity, but there was little available. Much local work, when it was available, went to the Kond, who would take it when they wanted and when needed, without the heavy burden of economic necessity. Wage work for most of the Kond was not a necessity for survival, whereas for the Pano it was. Such a situation also influences migratory trends. For the Kutiakond, migratory labor to Ernakulam in Kerala and Methoda in Gujarat as the most frequent places was undertaken primarily by groups of young men. People may have different reasons to migrate, but it was often not through compulsion. Swidden temporalities influenced these movements, people often heading out in the winter months when the work was less and returning in the cultivation months. For the Pano, men and women and often whole families undertook migratory work for much longer periods of time. Near the plains crossroads town of Tumurubanda, which is in the plains just below the highlands where I did my fieldwork, a group of Pangia Kond Adivasis, a different group of Kond, without land to cultivate, were working stone breaking by the roadside. I often passed on my way to one of the larger plains towns, groups of women and men sitting in the beating sun, hammering pieces of stone with small hammers, repetitively, over and over again. A clear contrast to Swidden work. Indeed, the way people worked was often commented upon. Wealthier Pano and Jalipadaru would often reproduce the official line of backwardness when talking about the Kond. But also, as one man said, say things such as, our Pano men and women don't work, they're lazy. The Kond work so hard on the Swiddens, but then they're always drinking. Then when they work for us, they come for a few days and then they just disappear. As Newt Bird David writes for the Nayaka in Kerala, people preferred to take up casual wage positions rather than permanent formal jobs, as this allowed them to disappear when they'd had enough. People engage with work through a morality of hunting and gathering. Fallowing too, perhaps, can be seen as a moral engagement, a cycling of effort, of stasis and motion, of activity and non-activity. Fallows exist in an alternate moral economy of value, where waste is defined differently. This is not the lack of productivity, but a lack of visible productivity in terms of the measured scales of development. In his earlier work, Tim Ingold wrote that in the task orientation, work and time are intrinsic to the conduct of life itself. Here we can perhaps bring in the concerns with attention and rhythm from earlier. In the capitalist orientation, this is undermined, and it's not only labor that becomes a commodity, but time, what E.P. Thompson referred to as the time thrift of clock time. Task time is the internal or localized small-scale logic of agency. Clock time is shaped by the external large-scale logic of temporally organized productivity. Of course, both swiddening and wage work are forms of making life, but there are differences. One is determined by a commensurable rhythm of clock time, numbers, and units, amidst the measured standards of productivity. Swidden life is relational, where rhythms are more improvisational, and perhaps we cannot even speak of commensuration. Rhythm here is about agencies and their interaction, with moments of mutual perception and integration, such as the rhythm finding of the ritual moments, such as Nella Rapondi, rather than formal measure. So swiddening is a way of making life, rather than just a productive means of making a living. It's also a form of life people choose. There are, however, some frictions. Both Kond and Pano are being pushed from an autonomous life into an imposed life. In this last section, I turn to the concept of life more generally. So in terms of land, this is not the classic story of agrarian upheaval. Land has not become a traded commodity. For the Kutiakond, there may even be an improvement on the past, as they maintain their subsistence, their spatial autonomy, while taking advantage of the opportunities of the present. In terms of labor, it is temporal and rhythmic orientations that are central. Fallows represent a liminal position between productive pasts and productive futures. There are moments of effort fallow, moments of sitting, feasting, and dancing. But life itself also comes in fallows. There is a dangerous moment of suspension, for example, before the dead can leave the community of the living and join the community of the dead. There are periods of liminal fallow in the cyclical ancestral time onto which individual biographical time is lived. Life, meanwhile, appears under many guises: biological and vital processes, biographies and life course rituals, the act of giving and taking life, or ethical ideas of the good life and the bare life. Pierre Petrou suggests that we should interrogate the concept of life in the same way that we interrogated the concept of nature. Life is materially and biologically grounded, of course, but there are these processes are differently understood. So too, there are cognitive, spatial, temporal, intersubjective elements that come from particular understandings of these vital processes and particular ways of being and acting in the world. In this talk, I focused on one of these vital processes, labor action, as part of making life itself. Georg Simmel suggested that humans, perhaps in ways that mark them as distinct from animals, hypostatize and objectify their own forms of life. Or as João de Pina Cabral has written, persons do not only live, they conceive life. Recent work has sought to question more the cosmological basis of vitalism, emphasizing not just spiritualized cosmological forces, but real lived processes. Tim Ingold, for example, has refuted the opposition of form and life in favor of form giving as the process of life. In his wonderful ethnography of the Dongria Khond in nearby Rayagada district, Roland Hardenberg suggests that the main value at stake for the Khond is fertility or life, referred to by the terms Jiu and Jela, and originating from the female goddess. For the Kutia Khond, I noted a tripartite distinction. Firstly, there is linga. This is distinct from the Hindu tradition, where it refers to a phallic force. Here it comes under the female idiom, associated with the act of birth and the household. Then there is Jiu, or soul, a concept related to the transfer of ancestral souls to new persons, such as at name-giving rituals. So here on the left, this buffalo sacrifice is for the festival of Jiu Rapondi, which is Jiu coming back and inhabiting the body of a young child. The child was about 6 at the time. And on the right is a ritual for Linga Penu, which is just before the birth of a new child. And it's a young banana plant there, which was important for Linga Penu. And thirdly, there is Jela, a term which has many meanings that may overlap with Jiu, but I found it most commonly used for life garnered through action in the world, dependent on recognition and circulating as a kind of local fame. A good feast where guests become insatiated with food and drink serves to show the Jela of the village, as does an abundant flow of palm wine, the health of the swidden fields. Jela, in a sense, represents a relational concept of life. So Hardenberg suggests that through trade, marriage, and sacrifice, the value of life, as well as wealth, is gained through either violent appropriation, negotiation and bargaining, or sharing and distribution. While I would in many respects agree, I wonder if we can interrogate more the concept of life. The terms Jela, Jiu, and Linga, and the contradictory us-centric nature of Kutia Khond cosmology does not point to a unitary notion of life. Taking inspiration from Petrou, rather than obtaining, giving, and taking life, perhaps we could say it's rather made. Not life as given or life as a resource, but life that is made through a sequence of actions undertaken in the world. It was through the actions of mythical and past persons that life was made, actions recounted extensively in ritual recitations, just as the activities of those in the present continue to make life. So Lingantani, which literally birth mother, mixed grains in a winnowing fan to make the world, just as the first persons, Raniaru Bendiaru, cultivated the first swidden hillsides. People may have been born from Linga and have the same Jiu as certain ancestors, but it's through their continued production of Jela, through certain activities, that they make their lives and they make life itself. Perhaps the mythical science of life, to use Hokart's terms, is understood almost an analogy to swidden work. I think we can see this notion of life as making more clearly when situated in terms of the kind of broader political and economic processes and dynamics here. For the younger generation, Jiu and Linga are of little concern, and in some contexts, there are only a few people able to recount cosmological principles. The notion of Jela, however, has taken on new meanings: the abundance of palm wine, the temporal orientations of the swiddens, the ability for an autonomous life. It's drawing people back from migratory work, from residential schools, and from employment. Jella is relational, and it continues, and it's only by continuing to engage in swiddening that it continues to be made. At the same time, broader political and economic shifts mean that some forms of life are no longer available. Poorer Pano, but also some poorer Kond, impacted by the shifting land patterns and understandings of land use described earlier with the Forest Rights Act, pushing some people into forms of imposed life. These processes have been evident most clearly in the plains, where any historical closeness between the two groups has been broken down, as they're incorporated in different terms into the wider state economy. So to conclude, the Adivasis of central India have been engaged with the forces of world capital for hundreds of years. As Marshall Salins wrote, one of the surprising things about late capitalism is that supposedly traditional cultures are not necessarily incompatible with it. The Kutia Kond, who still retain land and subsistence, as well as ritual distinctiveness, continue to make for themselves, for the time being, a largely autonomous life. For the Panoa, however, their neighbours, as the traditional interaction with the Kond have been broken down, many have been forced into forms of imposed life, structured by the spatio-temporalities of world capital. So in this talk, I started by setting out the place of swiddening in the changing agrarian economy, suggesting that it does not exist in contradistinction to modernity. Secondly, I considered the ritual of Nelo Opondi, the opening of the swidden fields, as a means of collapsing the distinction between work and ritual, economy and religion. Thirdly, I considered the broader rhythms of swiddening and wage work, and that it was this kind of rhythmic form giving that gave distinctiveness to this way of making life. But it's also a form of life that people choose. Swiddening may provide a rhythm, but it's not the only one. People modulate and make rhythms their own, mixing swidden rhythms with those of capital, with wage labor, with cash crops, and even with employment, to achieve not just resonance with their environment, but to make life for themselves. Life for the Kutia Kond does not correspond to pressure, necessity, or environmental determinism. They continue to make it for themselves. Still, I have also suggested that the protective measures such as the Forest Rights Act are encouraging processes of enclosure and bringing about a greater permanence in land holdings and understandings of land use. These processes are as yet incomplete. Shifts are taking place too in education and the shifting political horizons of young people, particularly the rise in Hindutva-inspired ideologies among educated young people. Although beyond the scope of this talk, these processes perhaps pose the greatest challenge to the persistence of this way of making life and its ecological, social, and rhythmic entanglements. Thank you.